Last Sunday, I was with the confirmation class in New York City, and one of the places we visited was the Bowery Mission. The Bowery Mission is an outreach ministry to men and women struggling with homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness. And most of them are struggling with all three. We go at lunchtime so that we can eat with the people receiving the services, and most years the lunch is pretty good. Often the leftovers from some of New York's fine eating establishments. The lunch last Sunday was not so good. A salad that had contents that I couldn't identify for the kids, and a bowl of chicken soup that was okay, but nothing to write home about. I later told the kids that I recognized that lunch had not been so good, but that I thought there was a valuable lesson in a lunch that left something to be desired. We had already enjoyed some good food before we got to the Bowery Mission, and we were going to enjoy some more good food after our visit to the Bowery Mission. I suggested that our luncheon could give us a greater sense of appreciation for the food that we had already enjoyed and the food that we would enjoy after our visit to the Bowery Mission. I observed that the people at the Bowery Mission did not enjoy the options that we take for granted, and that it was likely a good lesson for us to sup soup with them so that we could better appreciate what was before us the next time that we ate. We begin a season of reflection on Christian stewardship today as we think about all that God has given us and contemplate what we will give to support ministries like Messiah in the coming year. I thought a good way to begin such contemplation was to ask a question that rarely gets asked, and that is the question of our response when good things happen to good people. In church, we focus more on when bad things happen to good people. But we don't really think much about when good things happen to good people. Maybe when good things happen to bad people, which makes us mad and likely takes us in directions we shouldn't go. You'll remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount observing how God allows the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous, and the rain to do the same. My interpretation of that text is that God is gracious to everyone, even those who are ungracious. And it raises the question of our response. The same sort of question is at work in our scripture reading this morning from Deuteronomy. The people are reminded how they have been given all kinds of good things they did not provide. Just for fun this morning, let me ask, who among us this morning was here when they formed Messiah? Or let me put it this way. How many of us, when we came to Messiah, came to a sanctuary and classrooms that had already been built long before we ever got here? Then the text warns, when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. At one of the places where we worshiped last Sunday, And believe it or not, we worshiped in more than one place, and yes, that's legal. The text for the day was the story of the 10 lepers who Jesus healed, and how all 10 of them came back to thank Jesus, being good Israelites like they were. Now, if you believe that, turn to Luke 17 and read verses 11 through 19, because you need to read the Bible more than you need to listen to me. As I have studied the decline of Christian faith in the United States and Europe, I've also taken note of the places where Christianity is growing. Do you know where Christianity is growing? To keep things simple, we'll just say the global South. Now, what can you tell me about the economies of the global South? For the most part, not nearly as good as ours. So naturally, I came up with a theory about the correlation of the health of the church and the state of the economy. It seems that when the economy is in the trash can, the health of the church is outstanding. But when the economy gets good, the Christian faith ends up in the trash can. When I came to Messiah, the district superintendent, that's my immediate boss, not my ultimate boss, and my ultimate boss is not the bishop, wanted me to go to Korea to study church growth. I didn't say anything, but went over to my bookshelf and pulled off a volume entitled From Times Square to Timbuktu. I asked him to read the section which reports, in South Korea, Christianity has grown faster over the past century at 6.17% than anywhere else in Asia. From only about 50,000 Christians in 1910, the Korean church has grown to more than 20 million, about 41% of South Korea's population. Now, that would seem to support why he wanted me to go. But I told him to keep reading. It continues, but that growth has subsided, with Korean churches barely maintaining their present percentage of overall population. And I asked him what had changed, and suggested that the economy had gotten better. When I was in Cuba a few years ago, I learned that Methodism was growing at a rate of 13% a year. From my perspective, that's the best reason to continue the sanctions. If free trade opens up, it'll likely kill the church there. So what is it about us that we seem to need to have hardship in order to truly appreciate Christian faith? You'll remember how after 9/11, people were flocking into the churches. I think that lasted about 6 weeks. I mean, the president told us to go back to the shopping malls. Can you imagine what archaeologists are going to speculate about the purpose of shopping malls when they dig them up 1,000 years from now? They'll describe some religious tradition that prompted people to build these huge complexes. And of course, they'll do much the same with sports stadiums. Maybe I should be praying, Lord, send us a catastrophe. It shouldn't take a catastrophe to help us appreciate the goodness of life. It may be that for those of us who know the goodness of life, that we have a much greater challenge than we recognize. It was Jesus who talked about how hard it will be for those who are rich to enter the kingdom. And just to be clear, most of us in this sanctuary this morning are rich, richer than most of the people who have lived on the face of the earth. It's my impression that we will not know how to respond to the goodness of life until we acknowledge and embrace the goodness of our lives. I have the privilege of joining a lunch group about once a month. A member of this church invited me to be a part of the group, and I will not reveal this person's identity in order to protect the guilty. We go to this really nice place out on the eastern shore and get crab cakes. The place also has some outstanding desserts, which is really the last thing we need after eating a delicious lunch. Yet our host insists on us getting dessert. And while I'm not one to want to offend someone, at a recent lunch, a young man, much younger than myself and in much better shape than I am, declined to have dessert. I leaned over and said, "You know, someday you're going to be in the hospital, and you're going to wish that you would have had that dessert today." He ordered dessert. The movie Awakenings is a true story about some patients at the Bainbridge Psychiatric Hospital in New York City. In the 1920s, there was an epidemic of encephalitis in this country, which caused an inflammation of the brain, and people suffering from the disease experienced a coma-like state and rigidity of the body. In 1969, when a new drug by the name of dopamine was developed for people with Parkinson's, it was used experimentally with these patients who had been incapacitated for almost 50 years. The drug brought the patients out of the catatonic state and restored them to normal functioning. The movie's central character is a man named Leonard, who was struck with the disease when he was 11 years old, and he slipped into a coma at the age of 20 in the late 1930s. Because of the drug, Leonard regains his consciousness and mobility after 30 years. After losing 30 years of life, Leonard and the other patients discover that much has changed, and yet they discover something that never changes. In the movie, there's a scene where the doctor, who in real life was Oliver Sacks, receives a late-night phone call, and Leonard tells him that he has something important to tell him and that he needs to see him right away. When the doctor arrives at the hospital in the middle of the night, Leonard greets him by saying, "We've got to tell them." To which the doctor responds, "Tell them what, Leonard?" Leonard excitedly throws open his arms and smiles and says, "Tell them how good life is, how good their families, friends, jobs, and schools are, how good it all is." The tragedy of the movie is that all of the patients who were helped by the drug eventually reverted back to their catatonic state. After seeing the movie, I found a book by the doctor, Oliver Sacks, on which the movie is based. I was so moved by the movie that I wanted to learn more about those patients and their fate. Sacks wrote that psychologists had been unable to determine why the patients reverted back to their catatonic state. While the movie suggested that the drug's effectiveness had waned and lost its power, Sacks shared that some psychologists felt that those people rediscovered something that was so depressing, in that people who had never suffered from the disease had no appreciation for the goodness of life, that the patients caused themselves to revert back to that catatonic state. Whatever the reasons for those patients reverting back to their catatonic state, the greatest tragedy is all of us who never lose consciousness and yet fail to make Leonard's discovery about the goodness of life. So what will be your answer to the question of when good things happen to good people?